shifting our attention now into understanding the national risks around climate change. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Holly Walker and Norton Atkins, so two speakers in this next presentation. So Holly has spent a career at the intersection of policy, politics and system change with a focus on equity and climate change, and Holly's the project director for New Zealand's second national climate change risk assessment, which will be delivered in 2026. Norton Atkins is an analyst at the Climate Change Commission, working primarily in the agricultural area across climate adaptation and mitigation. He's a byproduct of Aotearoa's New Zealand's agricultural sector, and he was born and bred in rural New Zealand with many years spent farming hands-on both here and overseas. So I'm going to hand over to Holly and to Norton. Welcome.
Kia ora, thank you. O ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Ko waiahau, who am I? No ingarangi me kotirana o ki tipuna, so my ancestors come from England and Scotland. I tipu au I raru I te raukura o Te Atiawa I Te Awa Kairangi, so I grew up in Lower Hutt in the rohi of the Te Atiawa people. Ko Holly Walker tōku ingoa, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much for having us here. I'll let Norton introduce himself briefly as well, and then I'm going to run through some introductory material about the national risk assessment that we're undertaking, and then Norton is going to talk a bit about the risks that are specifically of interest for the food safety sector. But do you want to do a quick Norton?
Kia ora everybody. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Kia ora everyone. I'm Norton Atkins. Yeah, just excited to be here to talk today.
Great. Let me introduce what we're going to cover. So we only have 20 minutes. We're going to go as fast as we can. Obviously, we're already running a little late, but we'll do our best to stick to time, which reminds me to turn on my timing device here. So we're going to introduce you to the National Risk Assessment, tell you a little bit about the project that we're working on, talk about what we mean when we talk about climate risk, which does have a really particular meaning. And then talk briefly about how we're going about the task of assessing and prioritising risks to the country from climate change. Then Norton will talk about, in particular, the risks that are relevant to food safety and some of the key insights from our preliminary analysis. It might be ambitious to think we have time for questions and discussion, but luckily it is morning tea right after this, so you can always come and chat with us then. So in terms of the introduction to the risk assessment, what we as the Climate Change Commission are doing here, this is a one every 6 year undertaking that is part of our statutory responsibilities under the Climate Change Response Act. So you may be familiar with this cycle of emissions budget advice that the Commission produces, which feeds into the government producing an emissions reduction plan. That's in the climate change mitigation space. As Shamabeel said, we haven't given up on mitigation yet at the Commission, but it is certainly true that we also need to have a really strong focus on adaptation and preparing ourselves for the impacts that are not only coming but already here. So there is an equivalent cycle in the Act around adaptation where every 6 years the Commission will produce a national risk assessment. It identifies, among other things, the most significant risks facing the country from climate change, and then the government is required to respond to those in particular in its next national adaptation plan. We are currently producing the second national risk assessment. The first was done in 2020. The Commission was only just being stood up at that time, so that was undertaken by the Ministry for the Environment. So this will be the first time the Commission has actually undertaken the risk assessment in-house. And the idea is that the government will have 2 years to respond with its national adaptation plan, obviously take actions in response to try and mitigate these risks and to adapt to the risks facing the country from climate change. And then we will report against progress against that plan, and that works in a cycle. You may have noticed there's been some recent changes announced to the Act, but this basic cycle will stay in place. Just the frequency of the progress monitoring may change slightly as a result of those recently announced changes. So we've got two kind of key tasks in the risk assessment. That is to assess the risks facing the economy, society, environment, and ecology. So a really sort of holistic scope. From both the current and future effects of climate change. And then from that, identifying the most significant risks based on the nature of those risks, their severity, and the need for coordinated action to respond to them in the next 6 years. And that's on the basis of that, we advise government on where to focus their next adaptation plan. And then it's probably important to do a little bit of establishing of terminology here, because climate risk means something really specific, and it's important that we understand, I guess, the difference between risks and hazards. So in this context, much like any organisation would run a risk register or have a risk management system, we're kind of thinking about that for the whole country for climate change. I think it's natural when thinking about climate risk to ask questions like, oh, so how much is sea level rise going to, how much, is sea level rise going to affect my community, or is the next storm is going to take out our roads again? And those are really legitimate questions about climate change, but those are, in the parlance of climate risk assessment, actually about climate hazards. So there's a key distinction between what are the hazards, which are those climate-related physical events or trends that we're going to experience more and more of in the coming years. So sea level rise, drought, extreme weather events, and climate risk, which is a combination of hazards and a number of other things as well. So exposure being who or what is exposed to the hazard, people, places, things, vulnerabilities being the factors that determine how much of an impact those hazards are going to have on those exposed people, places, or things, and then responses. So whether actions that are already underway to respond to the risks or to respond to climate change are working or not, and could in fact be contributing to driving further risk. So risk is a really holistic concept that does not just about how much is climate change going to change our exposure to hazards, but what will happen to the country, or what could potentially happen to the country as a result of a combination of these things. And so therefore we have these 7 quite holistic domains of risk that we are investigating. So we're looking at risks to the natural environment, ecosystems, biodiversity, things like that, risks to sectors that rely on the natural environment, and we'll be hearing clearly more about those because it's highly relevant to this sector. Risks to people, health and communities, so that's things like their physical and mental health and well-being, social cohesion. Risks to the built environment, transport, buildings, electricity, telecommunications infrastructure, things like that. Risks to the economy and financial system, and risks to governance. And I was noting again in Shamabil's talk earlier, it was interesting that we were ending up in a conversation about trust in institutions and political polarization. It is a big part of climate risk assessment, actually, and it's not intuitive necessarily to think that that's what we'll be talking about when we talk about climate change risk. But when we follow these kind of impact chains from the hazard through to the exposure and what it does to those people and places and things that are exposed to risk, and then where we end up, it is often in a place of governance challenge and trust in institutions. So very much in frame for us as well. And then finally in the centre, ngā mea hira hira o te ao Māori. So this is new since the first risk assessment, a domain specifically for assessing risks and impacts on Māori. So just to give you a flavour, an example of the breadth, I guess, of some of the kinds of risks we're analysing, you'll see there, risks to social cohesion and community and cultural wellbeing. Perhaps not intuitively what people would first think of when you think about analysing risks from climate change, but this is driven by displacement. So if people are going to have to move from where they're currently living because of their exposure to climate hazards, if that is not well managed, that creates both governance and social cohesion challenges that are very real. And so they're very much in frame for our risk assessment, and a couple of other examples from other domains there as well. And then I guess the other thing to think about is the fact that while we have to take these and analyse them as individual risks, of course, we know that how they play out in the real world is as a cascade. So when there is either gradual change like sea level rise or gradual temperature change, or an immediate event like a flood or a storm as a result of climate change, the number of risks may be triggered at once, or they may trigger each other. So again, we might see that the first impact is a weather-related one that causes damage to infrastructure or buildings or properties or businesses. That has social and economic impacts, both regionally and personally for families and communities. That may lead to business closures, that may have mental health impacts, that may lead to ongoing social wellbeing and cohesion issues. So we have to think not only about the individual risks, but how they cascade into each other. So it's quite a challenging task, as you can imagine, and it covers quite a lot. But somehow within that, we still have to prioritise between all these many risks and give advice to government about where to focus their adaptation plan. And so to do that, we score each risk for a number of different things. So if we go back to our task to assess them based on the nature, their severity, and the need for coordinated action to address them, we've come up with a way of trying to score and prioritise that will help us to do that. So we've accorded the risks a score for their severity, both now in 2025, how they're likely to play out mid-century in 2050, and how they're likely to play out at the end of the century under two different global warming scenarios, if we had a 2 degrees world or if we had a 3 to 3.5 degrees world. And we give them a score from minor, moderate, major, or extreme based on what we understand about the research and the evidence available about how these risks are likely to play out. We then score them for policy readiness. So we do an assessment of how ready we are as a country to respond to these risks at a national level. That considers, are there policies, plans and actions in place to address them? If there are, how well covered are they? Do we have the actual capacity to implement those policies, plans and actions? And even if we did, how much of the risk would be left over? We look at their relationship to each other, the way that they might play out and impact each other. If we addressed one risk, if we addressed it really well, would that have the potential to address others of the risks that we're assessing? And then we also look at the particular considerations for Te Ao Māori. And through all of that, which is the process we're in the middle of doing right now, we identify those priority risks and give our advice to government. So we're talking to you when we're sort of midstream in that process. So I'll stop there. That's kind of my introduction to the risk assessment, the task as a whole. And I'm going to hand over to Norton now to talk to you a bit about the specific risks relevant to food safety that we're analysing in the assessment.
Thanks, Holly. Okay. So the ones that I'll talk to today are these three that sit in that sectors relying on the natural environment domain. We've got pastoral farming, so I'm just speaking about animal-based agriculture, and in New Zealand's obviously mainly dairy and sheep and beef. And then horticulture and arable sort of sectors, so the things that like plant-based agriculture, not for animal consumption, from apples, onions, oats and other crops. And then also fisheries and aquaculture, which is also a really broad one too. So it's saltwater, freshwater, commercial fisheries and recreational as well. So in the first NCCRA, the land-based primary industries were grouped together, ag, hort and forestry, into sort of a risk to land-based primary sector productivity and output due to climate change impacts. And they also identified an opportunity for increased primary sector productivity due to warming temperatures. But for the second NCCRA, we've separated these because Holly showed the propeller diagram with hazard, exposure, vulnerability. So we've separated them out as sort of exposure can vary between the sectors and vulnerability can vary too, even though some of the responses sort of interact with one another. Yep, got it. Yeah. So obviously food systems are more than what just sits inside the farm gate, which is like the topic of today, really. So in the other domains, there's risks that have a compounding or cascading impact on the food production and quality. For example, in the built environment domain, there's wastewater systems can contaminate the receiving environment, which could be any of those sectors, agriculture, horticulture, or aquaculture. Drinking water too. Sort of, I've recently heard about wine producers in Marlborough who are concerned about the possibility that their water supply will be chlorinated because this could taint their wine. Roads, rails, and ports are all critical for getting inputs to producers, but also for getting their products out. And electricity transmission's obviously similarly essential. You can't milk cows without electricity, but you also can't chill milk. You may not be able to irrigate or get water to your animals. The people health in the community's domain. People are going to be impacted physically and mentally by climate change, and that could affect workforce safety, or their productivity or availability. In the natural environment domain, things like hydrological cycles will change, and this might impact what water is available for irrigation and where. And in the other way, the responses to the risk to food production could negatively or positively affect the receiving environment. So now I'll quickly go back to those three main risks that I highlighted before. Try not to get too bogged down on this one, but it's my area. So pastoral farming. This is a sector that's highly exposed to climate hazards. Probably won't be like a startling insight that farming is outdoors and depends on the weather. And so in this area, I sort of think of direct effects on pastures and forage crops, which is the feed supply that our systems are built around, and then direct effects on animals, things like heat stress, which is what that little those maps in New Zealand are up there and showing. Heat stress for dairy cattle is projected to increase mid-century. And there's interacting effects too from the effect of the feed supply on the animals. And in terms of climate change impacts, extreme events get a lot of the attention. So droughts, floods, storms. But there are a lot of gradual changes which erode the productivity of the primary sector. So just chipping away bit by bit and layering on top of each other. Those are things like increasing temperature, variability in rainfall, pests, diseases, and sea level rise. So within the pastoral sectors, sensitivity can vary. And there are many factors that affect that. One example is pasture production is very sensitive to precipitation. Can't grow grass without water. But in a dry situation, though dairy, sheep and beef will both have reduced productivity, dairy tends to be better able to manage that, to buy feed, and the prices of farm gate prices can increase in response to a drought. And the other point is timing. Timing of the extreme events can be really critical. There's a picture there of an irrigator knocked over in the recent storms, which happened at peak of production. So this can have an effect for the whole season. And another example is sort of drought in the autumn. The drought extending into the autumn can have subsequent effects on the following year, especially for sheep and beef. So the farm systems in New Zealand obviously have built themselves around a certain level of climate variability, and we're able to cope with the sort of existing tools that we have at the moment, and just get better at what farmers do. And then research sort of tends to focus on problems that are here and now, things like facial eczema and pasture persistence. There are areas of research being undertaken now, but experts sort of in agricultural adaptation think that this will only take us so far, and in the future it might not be a sufficient response to to manage the risk and stop production decline. But on the bright side then, depending on your point of view, we might see some tipping points where other high value land uses become more favorable. I just wanted to show this this chart quickly, sort of from Craddock Henry et al. We're kind of, does that work? We're kind of there at the moment. So as degrees of climate change increase, the amount of adaptation needed and the actions available to us sort of increase. So we're here in the red sort of circle at the moment, just adjusting practices and technologies, trying to grow maybe different varieties, put irrigation in, and then some people, there's examples of changing systems. Just last week I was in the Waikato, and I visited a farm that has shifted from a spring calving dairy farm system to autumn calving system, because they now reliably grow more grass in the winter than they do in the summertime. So that's the type of thing that might fit there into strategic adaptation. And then there's more transformational change, new products, new industries, which is potentially an opportunity for the next risk area of horticulture. We talk about opportunities for horticulture, but we also know there's a lot of barriers existing. There's high capital costs, labor, water, markets, etc. And then they're also highly exposed to climate hazards. There's dozens of different horticultural products, and think more that we could grow. So I'll just flip to some vulnerabilities. One particular vulnerability is that plants can't move out of the way of the flood like animals can. But then some of those areas that are susceptible to flooding are really highly valuable horticultural land. Another vulnerability is that some small growers might not have the scale or capacity to adapt to all the hazards. I'll just touch on this one really briefly because I know there's more talks on fisheries later on in the afternoon. The oceans are sort of exposed to a bit of an unseen toll. They are buffering the effect of climate change, absorbing the heating and absorbing the carbon dioxide. And warming at a faster rate in New Zealand than other parts of the world. And we're getting unexpected changes occurring. And in this area, the risk can be compounded by other human activity. And I mentioned some of that before regarding wastewater. So moving on, I thought this might be a nice opportunity to just present some work that we had commissioned from the Manaaki Whenua Survey of Rural Decision Makers. So this is new, and I've just taken the figures out of their report, so they're a little bit hard to interpret on the slides. But the first question was like a branching question, and it was like, do you believe climate change is occurring? It's hard to tell because it was framed differently in previous surveys. The survey happens every 2 years, but it looks like the level of belief in climate change is getting a slightly worse. That's not to throw shade on those people. It's just something to be aware of, and the survey then branched from there. And so this question was asking producers how they expect climate change will impact their property, New Zealand agriculture as a whole, and global agriculture. And there's a bit of positivity bias, where people are really expecting that their properties won't be affected as much as New Zealand, and in particular the world. And I was just thinking during some of the other talks that maybe there's an opportunity for us to like make this true. Yeah, and farmers are adapting. Farmers and growers and foresters, they're adapting. We don't know how they're adapting from these questions, but so this question was, have you made changes as a result of changing weather patterns? And you can see that more than half of people strongly agree that they are making changes currently due to the weather patterns. And then we asked another group of people, have you made changes to avoid damage from extreme weather events? And this one we could compare from people that believe in climate change and those that don't. So the believers are on the left, yeah, and the non-believers are on the right. And you can see that there's a difference there. So that the people that don't believe in climate change are taking less action to adapt. Yeah, and that's all I got. Just a little taster of those.
No time for this.
Yeah.
If you just flip to the last slide. So we are delivering a risk assessment towards the middle of next year. But we do have on our website, climate change, I don't know what it is, but the Climate Change Commission's website has got a page specifically for updates about the risk assessment. So if you're interested, please sign up. And that's it. Thank you very much.